7 verses deal with the plight that God's people are facing. Asaph talks about the situation that they're in. And then verses 8 through 12 talk about the plea that he makes, and that's the heart of the psalm. And then he finishes up in verse 13 with the promise that he makes to give God the praise and the glory if God will see them through these difficulties. Let's take a look at the verses and kind of outline them as it is on the screen there for you. In verse 1 he says, O God, the heathen are come into thine inheritance. Thy holy temple have they defiled. They have laid Jerusalem on heaps. Notice that the psalmist is calling God's attention to what has taken place. The heathen people, evidently this psalm was written following the destruction of the city and the temple by the Babylonians and the carrying away into captivity. And so Babylon is the one that's under consideration here. And the Babylonians had defiled the temple. They not only had entered the city, but they had entered into the temple. They had entered into that place that was separate. And they have defiled that temple just in entering it. And then not only had they entered it, but they had carried away the gold and the silver and the spoils of that place in defiling the house of God. Of course, God had departed from it already because of their sins. And that's why they were allowed to enter into it to begin with. But the psalmist is greatly troubled by the fact that God's house has been defiled. Perhaps some in the audience have come home from being out somewhere, and when you walked in the door, you realized that someone had robbed your house. Someone had been in your house. Someone had dug through your drawers and gone through your jewelry and gone through the items that are precious and important to you. And they had strewn them out on the floor, and they had taken what they wanted. And in addition to the loss of whatever material goods there might have been, there's just that utter feeling that someone that doesn't belong there and that ought not to be there has been there and has rifled through your stuff. And there's just a defiling type of an image that comes with that. And there's just a sick feeling that you have to know that that is the case. If you've ever been through that, and you understand that. But this wasn't just your house that's been defiled, but rather it's God's house that's been defiled. And you know how important this house was in the Jewish mindset. And so for it to be defiled was for them to suffer a great blow in their lives before God. Notice in verse 2, it says, The dead bodies of thy servants have they given to be meat unto the fowls of the heaven, the flesh of thy saints unto the beasts of the earth. Here's death. Not only had defilement come, but death had come. Many of God's servants had been killed as the Babylonians came into the city. In fact, they were being killed in such great number, and they were being killed so rapidly there was not time to bury them. There were more dead than alive. And so there was no one to care for those that had been killed. Now, I suppose it's true of all people, but it's especially true of the Jewish people that they really cared for their dead. And they wanted the dead to be buried. And for the dead not to be buried was the greatest shame possible. Sometimes wicked kings, for example, in the Old Testament, God would say as a part of their punishment that the dew of heaven would fall upon them. They would not receive a burial. No one was supposed to mourn over them. That was a curse. That was a great punishment to suffer that end. And yet here are people, God's people, who were suffering that end. They weren't being treated properly even after they were gone. They were being abused and left for the beast of heaven. And what a sad state that was. And so you can see how it bothers the psalmist here. In verse 3, he says, Their blood have they shed like water round about Jerusalem, and there was none to bury them. We are become a reproach to our neighbors, a scorn and derision to them that are round about us. They had suffered this defilement. Now they had suffered death. And now we read of the derision, the mocking and ridicule that they had suffered as a result of this enemy that had entered in among them. They shed blood as if it was water. They didn't esteem life. Life wasn't important to them. They didn't value life. Now, if you know anything about the Jewish mindset, then you know that blood was extremely important to them. They had been taught that throughout their history. The life is in the blood, and blood is precious, and blood has meaning. Here's the enemy that entered in and literally killed them by the thousands. And they were shedding blood as if it had been water, and that meant nothing to them. Again, this is bothering the psalmist because of what's happening. Notice he says, beginning in verse 5, How long, Lord, wilt thou be angry? Forever? Shall thy jealousy burn like fire? Pour out thy wrath upon the heathen that have not known thee, and upon the kingdoms that have not called upon thy name. For they have devoured Jacob and laid waste to his dwelling place. Now this is disillusionment. Another problem that came as a result of the enemy. Now here's what the psalmist is struggling with. The psalmist sees those who know God and at least to some degree have tried to serve God. They haven't been perfect in that, and he will admit their sinfulness. And yet they have known God, and they are God's people, and they have tried to serve God, and yet God has allowed a people who doesn't know Him, who hasn't tried to serve Him, God has allowed those people to come in and to devour them and to destroy them. And the psalmist is struggling with that. God, I don't understand that. I don't understand how that you could destroy a more righteous people with a more wicked people. If you know the book of Habakkuk, then you know that that's the great issue of that book that the writer is struggling with. How can you use this wicked nation to destroy your people? But that's what had happened. God was using the Babylonians to punish His people, and He was struggling with that because the Babylonians worshipped idols. They were a wicked people. They were a bloodthirsty people, and yet they had the upper hand at the moment. And He's asking simply, how long? How long is this going to be allowed to go on? Now, the timetable had already been set. The prophets had already said 70 years. So that's how long this is going to be. But it must have seemed like an eternity to them as they were being destroyed. Notice he says in verse 7, the destruction that's come, they've devoured Jacob, they've laid waste his dwelling place. They've destroyed that which is so precious. Now, in large measure, we've never experienced that. We experienced that as a nation to some degree during the Civil War. But we really have been spared from great destruction in our country. Other countries, Europe, for example, has been laid waste, where our country has largely been spared from that, other than the bombing at Pearl Harbor, that type of thing. But we've been spared. We really have not had places that are special and important to us laid in ruins. We really can't imagine what that would be like. To see a city that's always been your place. It's where you were raised, where you went to school, where you had your house, and suddenly look at that city and there's not a building standing in any direction. Everything is flattened. Everything is rubble. How hard that would be. And then when you add to that the fact that this city was the holy city and this city was God's city, and this was a city that God had spared on other occasions and not allowed people to destroy it, how upsetting that must have been to their mindset to see now the devastation that was here. And so that is the plight that they are in. But we begin the section that deals with the plea beginning in verse 8. He says, "O remember not against us former iniquities. Let thy tender mercies speedily prevent us, for we are brought very low." The psalmist is going to make a series of pleas here of God. First of all, he says in verse 8, "Pity us." Let thy tender mercies prevent us. Literally, let your tender mercies go before us. If you know anything about the way that they were carried away, it's not a very beautiful picture as they were led away into captivity. Their captors were cruel. Their captors were very, very oppressive in the way that they carried them away into captivity. And so here Asaph is asking for tender mercy, for God to have pity upon His people as He's done on so many other occasions. Notice he says in verse 9, "Help us, O God of our salvation, for the glory of Thy name, and deliver us and purge away our sins for Thy name's sake." First of all, he says, pity us, and now he says, purge us. Take away our sins. He isn't denying that they're sinful. He isn't denying that this punishment that's come upon them is just. He isn't denying that. But he is asking God to purge them or to take away their sins, that they might again be in God's favor, that they might again be in God's grace. And he's asking God to do it for His name's sake. And we'll deal with that a little bit more when we move to the end of the lesson. Notice in verse 10, Wherefore should the heathen say, Where is their God? Let him be known among the heathen in our sight by the revenging of the blood of thy servants which is shed. Let the sighing of the prisoner come before thee. According to the greatness of thy power, preserve those that are appointed to die. Here he says, preserve us. We're going to go away into captivity. We're going to suffer there, but preserve us. Spare us there. So much death all around them. Those that were alive were asking God to preserve them, protect them, keep them alive. To hear their sighing. Now, this word is only used about 5 times in the Old Testament. It's a word that's used to describe the weasel. The weasel makes a very interesting kind of cry. And that's the picture here. It's that kind of a weasel-like cry that they're uttering and asking God to hear them. You remember that when they were in Egyptian bondage, that God heard them and God responded to their cries. He's requesting the same type of thing to take place here. So here's the plea. He's pleading for God to pity him, to purge him, and to preserve him. But now we move to the promise of verse 13. It says, So we, thy people, and sheep of thy pasture, will give thee thanks forever. We will show forth thy praise to all generations. God, if you will preserve us, and you will pity us, and you will pardon us, then we promise that we will give you thanks. We promise that we will teach other generations about you. We're going to be the kind of people we need to be if you'll simply have mercy on us and bring us back to our homeland. That's the psalm laid out in outline form. Now let's go back and talk about this plea and the basis for this plea, which is the basis for our plea as well today. Now, the psalmist pleads with God on this basis, that God do this not for His people's sake, but for His own sake. It's as if Asaph realizes we can't plead with God on behalf of our own goodness, because we don't have any standing. We can't say, God, do this because we've been so good. Because Asaph says we haven't been good and our fathers weren't good. We didn't do what we should have done. That's why this has happened. We know that. And so he can't plead with God on that basis. So he has to plead with God on the basis of God's name. And the fact that God ought to do this out of concern for His own name. Notice he says in verse 9, Help us, O God of our salvation, for the glory of Thy name, and deliver us and purge away our sins for Thy name's sake. God, we're asking You to do this not because we deserve it. We're asking You to do this because You're a great God and Your name is a great name. God, if You don't do this, then Your name is going to suffer reproach. If You don't do this, then Your name is going to be affected in this. That's one of the things that we fail to understand as Christians, is when we do the wrong thing and we get involved in things that we ought not to be involved in, not only do we damage our name, but God's name is wrapped up in us because we wear the name Christian. And so when we don't live as we ought to live, then God's name suffers reproach based upon our actions. That's why this is a public matter. That's why it needs to be taken care of in a public way. Is because we not only have drug, as it were, our name through the muck, we've done that with God's name. We've done that with the name of Christ. Because people are going to reflect upon Christianity based upon how we live, based upon what we do. And the psalmist is basically arguing that right here within this psalm. Now, as we look at this psalm, this is something that you may not notice on the first reading. But from the beginning of the psalm to the end of the psalm, he talks about things that are God's. He's not talking about things that belong to him or things that belong to the Jewish people, but rather he's talking about these things that belong to God. Notice the way that he builds up in this psalm, beginning in verse 1. O God, the heathen are come into Thine inheritance. God, this is Your inheritance. Now, God gave that land to them. You remember how He divided it out among the tribes. But that's not the way the psalmist talks about it. He doesn't talk about it as our inheritance. He says it's Your inheritance. We understand it really belongs to You. And so when they come up and they take this land away from us, they're not just taking it away from us, they're taking it away from You because it's Your land. You gave it to us. It belongs to You. We understand that. They're taking your inheritance. They're not just robbing us, they're robbing you. He says, Thy holy temple have they defiled. Was it their temple? Absolutely. They worshiped there, special to them. It meant something to them as a people and as a nation. But they refer to it as God's temple. It's God's house. And they want God to defend it on that basis. Not only have they come in and defiled something that's important to them, they've defiled something that's important to God. A house that's been called by His name. They've laid Jerusalem on heaps. The dead bodies of Thy servants. Notice, Thy servants. These are your people that they've done this to. Continuing down through this, he says, the flesh of Thy saints unto the beasts of the earth. These people lying out on the ground, they're your people. They're your saints. They're people who were called out of the nations to serve you. They belong to you. These aren't people you don't know. These are your people. They wear your name. They're identified with you. And they've been treated this way. You see how the psalmist is pulling at the heartstrings of God to get God to act. Notice verse 10, we again have this idea of servants. It says, by the revenging of the blood of Thy servants which is shed. Wants God to identify with these people. They're His servants. They're His saints. Notice in verse 13 of Psalm 79. So we, Thy people, not just any people, these are your people. These are your children that have been slain. These are the sheep of Thy pasture. These sheep belong to you. They're not the sheep of somebody else. They're your sheep and they've been slaughtered. He's pleading with God to feel the pain and to react to this situation. Now God's house had been defiled and His people had been put to death. And so the psalmist is arguing that this heathen nation, the Babylonians, had really reproached God. The greater part of the sin was against God and not against them. There was a level in which they deserved what had happened to them. But God didn't deserve what had happened to Him. He didn't deserve for His name to be dragged through the muck. He didn't deserve for His name to be tarnished by these actions. He didn't deserve that. And so the psalmist is asking God to act in defense of His name. Notice verse 12. And render unto our neighbors sevenfold into their bosom their reproach, wherewith they have reproached Thee, O Lord. Lord, they've said some horrible things about us, and yes, they've come to us and they've said, where is your God? And they've ridiculed us. And we had to bear up under that derision. God, they were really reproaching You because we're Your people. This is Your house. This is Your inheritance. They've done this against You. They've been reproaching You. Now, consider some other ways in which we see that in the Scriptures. You remember in Acts chapter 8 with Saul of Tarsus. He made havoc of the church. But in Acts chapter 9, on that road to Damascus, the question that was asked him is, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? You're persecuting me, Saul. Now, how was Saul persecuting him? By persecuting his people. By persecuting the church. If you persecute the church, you're not just persecuting men and women, you're declaring war on God. These are His children. These are His servants. These are His saints. This is that for which He gave His blood. That's the seriousness of this. You can't separate the two. And that's what Asaph is arguing in this psalm is God, You can't separate Your people or this city or this temple from You. It's Yours. It belongs to You. It wears Your name. And so when something happens to them, when something happens to it, it's as if it's happening to you. You're being affected in this, calling for God to act as a result of that. Now, another example of that would be David in Psalm 51. Remember in Psalm 51, we know that David sinned against a number of people. He sinned against Uriah. He sinned against the nation. He sinned against his family. He sinned against his own body. He sinned against Bathsheba. There was plenty of sin to go around. Do you remember the way that David described it in Psalm 51? Against thee, and thee alone, have I sinned. Now why did he describe it that way? Because ultimately, the wrong that he had done was against God. That was the greatest part of that wrong. He had wronged God in that action. They had wronged God in this action. And so the Asaph is asking for God to act on behalf of his name. Consider some other passages that talk about this. Exodus chapter 32, for example. This is Moses. Moses is making the same argument. Exodus chapter 32. And asking God to act on behalf of his people. This is the argument that he makes. God's ready to destroy them. He's ready to raise up more people through Moses. But notice what Moses says in verse 12. Wherefore should the Egyptians speak and say, for mischief did he bring them out, to slay them in the mountains, and to consume them from the face of the earth. Turn from thy fierce wrath, and repent of this evil against thy people. You see, if God destroyed these people, then it was going to be a reflection upon Him. Because the nations round about would say, He wasn't able to bring them into the promised land. He wasn't powerful enough to do it. Oh, the God that they served was a cruel God. He was a vengeful God. And He just brought them out here to destroy them. He's a cruel God. You don't want to serve Him. Charges like that would have been made against God. And so Moses is pleading for God to spare them because His name is wrapped up in them as a people. Go to Numbers chapter 14 and verse 13. Numbers chapter 14 and verse 13. Moses said unto the Lord, Then the Egyptians shall hear it, for thou broughtest up this people in thy might from among them. And they will tell it to the inhabitants of this land, for they have heard that the Lord art among His people, that thou, Lord, art seen face to face, and that thy cloud standeth over them, and that thou goest before them by daytime in a pillar of a cloud, and in a pillar of fire by night. Now if thou shalt kill all this people as one man, then the nations which have heard the fame of thee will speak, saying, Because the Lord was not able to bring this people into the land which He sware unto them, therefore He hath slain them in the wilderness. And now I beseech thee, let the power of my Lord be great, according as thou hast spoken, saying, The Lord is longsuffering and of great mercy, forgiving iniquity and transgression, and by no means clearing the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation. Pardon, I beseech thee, the iniquity of this people, according unto the greatness of thy mercy, and as thou hast forgiven this people from Egypt even until now. And the Lord said, I have pardoned according to thy word. But as truly as I live, all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord. You see the argument that Moses is making. Same argument Asaph's making here. God, if you don't do this, it's going to affect your name. It's going to affect the way people see you. Folks are going to hold you in derision if you don't show mercy and you don't pardon these people. Now, the way it was generally interpreted in the Old Testament, we can see why people interpreted it this way. If you were a part of a nation and you came up against that nation and you defeated that nation, then the way you looked at that is the gods that you serve are greater and stronger and more powerful than the gods of your enemies. That's what allowed you to be victorious. And so the argument that Asaph is making is, God, if the Babylonians come in and they destroy us and nothing happens to the Babylonians, then people are going to look at that and they're going to assume that the gods of Babylon are more powerful than you are. They're going to assume that their gods are the true God and that you're not really a God at all. God, we can't let that happen. So for the sake of your great name, act on behalf of your people. Now, the point that I want us to get from this is sometimes when we pray, we don't pray from this thrust. We don't pray from this understanding. We might approach God in prayer and say, God, bless this congregation because there are good people in this congregation. That is true. There are good people in this congregation. God, bless this congregation because there are people in this congregation that are really trying to do what's right. And I think that's true. But rather than approaching God from that standpoint, why don't we approach God from the standpoint that Asaph does in this psalm and say, God, the name of your Son is identified with this congregation. And if this congregation thrives, if this congregation grows, if this congregation is a vibrant and active and mission-minded people, God, you'll get glory for that. People will look and they'll think of, look at these people. Look how God's blessed them. Look at how God's helping them. Look at how God is shedding His grace on them. See, sometimes we ask because we think we deserve it, when in reality we may deserve what we get. We ought to ask for the sake of God because God does deserve it. He's done no wrong. His glory is wrapped up in this house. What happens to God's name if the South Haven Church, that has been vibrant, been growing, been a staple of this community for years, dwindles and dies? What happens if the number eventually shrinks to the point to where this building is abandoned and this congregation goes away? How would the people in this community interpret that? Would they say, oh, those people serve the true and living God. You know, God sure was good to them. No, that's not the interpretation they're going to put on that. That doesn't always mean that outward appearances are everything. Because you can see a big, thriving building. It doesn't mean that they're serving God. It doesn't mean God's blessings are on them. I'm just simply saying that's the way that people in the world tend to see things. You remember when Solomon built God's house in the Old Testament, what kind of house he wanted to build for God? A great house. Completely covered on the inside with gold. Precious timbers. Why? Because he wanted to worship in such a beautiful, wonderful place? Oh, because that place represented his God. And he wanted people to have the proper view and understanding and appreciation for the God that he served. We ought to be approaching God on behalf of this congregation on the basis that God's name is great, that a great price was paid to purchase the church. We want the world to know how glorious the church is. We want the world to be able to find the church that Jesus built and that Jesus bought and that Jesus fills. We want them to find that. So we're asking for God's blessings on that basis. Not because of anything we earned or we deserve, or not because we're worthy in any way. We simply are not, but He is. But His name is wrapped up in this. You know, think about the name that we wear as individuals, and think about the name that's printed on the sign out front. Church of Christ. Belongs to Him. We want people to have the proper appreciation and respect for Him. And we ought to be praying on that basis, that this community might come to know Him and how great and how wonderful He is and what He's done for His people. It's a great way to pray, and it's a way that we can pray and be sure that we're right in praying it, because there's no way we can exalt His name too much. There's no way that we could properly give the glory to His name that is deserving of His name. And so when we think about things, we ought to think about them as they are, as they belong to God. This is His Word. This is His house. We're His people. And understand that if something happens to this, if something happens to us, then that's a reflection upon the God that we serve. So we're pleading with God to be with us, to defend us, to protect us. Now think about the things that were happening to them and see if these aren't things that are occurring today. Defilement. Is God's house not being defiled today? Absolutely it is. Now, I'm not talking about in a physical kind of way. We understand this is just blocks and boards. We understand this, it's the people here, or the church. We understand that. But do we not live in a world of defilement? Do we not live in a day and age in which many are not unspotted from the world? There are many who wear the name of Christ who are spotted, defiled. What about death? Death is all around us. The church, in many places, is growing older and dying. Very little life left. Derision. Think of how the church is ridiculed and mocked in our world today. Sometimes we can't understand why the denominational world around us seems to be growing and prospering and we aren't. When we're God's people, we're trying to do God's will. How is it? That's the same disillusionment he was facing. The destruction, seeing things in ruins. It's a hard thing to see. Churches that have been thriving and successful and that we've always called home to literally be lying in ruins today is hard. We can relate to what the psalmist is saying, and we can ask for God to act on behalf of His name. Thank you very much for your attention tonight.